What if tyranny didn't just march in jackboots, but crept into your kitchen, rewrote your love letters, and told you what stew to eat on Sundays? The Nazi regime wasn't just monstrous, it was meticulous. Beneath the horror was a web of bizarre, petty, and downright ridiculous rules, each one a window into the madness of a system obsessed with control. This isn't about the battles they fought, it's about the curtains they banned, the names they changed, and the handshakes they criminalized. Welcome to the strangest side of totalitarianism, the part that micromanaged your entire life. Before we dive in, if dark history and strange truths are your thing, make sure to subscribe. We've got plenty more where this came from. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight deep dives? Lunch break rabbit hole? We see you. 1. Mandatory Heil Hitler greeting, the German greeting. In the summer of 1933, the German state made a small but very loud demand. Say hello. Correctly. And by correctly, they meant with your right arm rigid in the air and your lips forming the now weaponized phrase, Heil Hitler. Bureaucratically labeled the German greeting, this wasn't just a suggestion for public employees. It was a moral posture ritualized into daily life. Blink, and you might miss the quiet tyranny of it, turning how you greet someone into a loyalty oath. The absurdity wasn't just in the gesture, but in the surveillance culture it encouraged. You could be denounced by your neighbor for a lukewarm salute. A shopkeeper might lose their license for not greeting a customer with sufficient ideological flair. Even children were expected to participate. Imagine a playground dispute escalating into a political offense because someone failed to salute. And yes, it spread, like ideological glitter, into civil life, schools, street corners, morning meetings, and family gatherings. The greeting became an omnipresent pressure valve. Do it automatically or be seen as dangerous. You weren't just saying hello. You were declaring yourself not a threat. Every interaction became a mini-ceremony of state-pleasing pantomime. The message? Even your politeness belongs to the Reich. And just in case you thought you could escape the madness by sitting quietly at your desk, the regime had plans for that too. 2. Mandatory ideological sign-offs in official correspondence. Mit deutschem Gruß, Heil Hitler. If your spoken greetings were now subject to government choreography, it was only logical, by Nazi logic, that your written ones should follow suit. Enter the mandatory ideological sign-off. Mit deutschem Gruß. Heil Hitler. These were no longer optional closings. They were proof that your typewriter was sufficiently patriotic. Bureaucrats were the first targets. Government officials had to affix these greetings to even the most mundane memos. To the regional office, please send 3 shovels. Heil Hitler. Businesses, fearing suspicion, followed suit. It spread until correspondence itself became a battleground for political virtue. Letters were no longer communications. They were performative compliance. The irony? The Nazis marketed themselves as modernizers, as enemies of stuffy bureaucracy. But here they were, micromanaging the semicolons of state decorum. Tradition out. Slogans in. The regime had no interest in the elegance of language, only its obedience. What mattered wasn't what you wrote, but whether you ended it with the proper worship. The more trivial the document, the more chilling the control. A message about office supplies now bore the leader's name. A thank you note had to be state-approved. Deviate, and you weren't just rude, you were suspect. People edited their own letters like potential crime scenes. It was grammar with consequences. And in case you hoped to hide behind a joke, a clever pun, or even a private groan, think again. 2 rules in. And already, we've gone from weaponized greetings to politicized punctuation. If you're into this kind of deep, strange dive, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. And while we're decoding history's weirdest regulations, tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your clock right now? 3. Criminalizing criticism and even jokes as treachery, speech policing. Humor died quietly in Nazi Germany, smothered under paperwork. What began as censorship quickly metastasized into something far stranger, an official category of crime called Wehrkraftzersetzung, undermining military morale. It covered everything from organized dissent to telling a joke about the Führer's mustache. It wasn't just what you said, it was how someone else interpreted it. The regime weaponized vagueness, a grumble in a queue, a sarcastic remark at dinner, a raised eyebrow in the wrong company. Any of it could trigger a denunciation. The result? A country where people whispered in their own kitchens and taught their children not to repeat what they heard at home. The Gestapo didn't need to wiretap everyone. They had something better. Your co-workers, your neighbors, your cousin at the post office. Jokes became evidence. Irony became a liability. Even silence could be misread as insolence. It was the ultimate efficiency. The state didn't have to suppress your thoughts if it could make you afraid to have them. And yet, the absurdity was layered. This was a regime obsessed with controlling narratives, terrified of laughter, and yet brimming with its own mythical self-seriousness. It wanted to be seen as eternal, but feared punchlines, which is why it built courtrooms where sarcasm was treated like sabotage. But while the state was busy policing punchlines, it was also redesigning something far more sacred than jokes: the very symbols a nation salutes. 4. Reich flag law. The swastika becomes the national merchant flag. On September 15, 1935, Germany officially replaced its national flag with the swastika, a party symbol, once the stuff of fringe propaganda flyers, now fluttered from every government building, merchant ship, and classroom. The Reich flag law didn't just redesign a piece of cloth. It rebranded an entire country under one emblem and then enforced allegiance to it like it was a sacred relic. This wasn't just a symbolic move. It was legal, bureaucratic, and enforced. Schools had flag-raising ceremonies. Ships that didn't comply could be barred from port. The swastika wasn't just a flag. It was paperwork. It was protocol. It was expectation. Overnight, a symbol previously associated with party rallies became the only banner under which a German could sail, study, or salute. And the contradiction? For a regime that claimed to restore traditional values, this was a ceremonial decapitation of centuries of imperial and republican iconography. The old red, black, gold or red, white, black? Gone. History was edited and stitched into a new flag. But the real absurdity was how much legal energy was spent turning a propaganda logo into a legal mandate. National identity was collapsed into one image, one shape, one idea, then printed en masse, just to remind you what side of the story you were on. And if you thought politics couldn't possibly get more theatrical, just wait until creativity itself needed a government-issued permission slip. 5. Reich Chamber of Culture, RKK. You needed membership to work in the arts. In most societies, art is a form of rebellion. In Nazi Germany, it became a licensed activity. On September 22, 1933, the regime founded the Reich Chamber of Culture, and with it, the idea that you needed a government-issued membership card to be an actor, painter, author, or violinist. Not talented, just politically reliable. This wasn't merely censorship. It was infrastructure. Culture was divided into 7 professional chambers: music, film, theater, press, literature, visual arts, and radio. If you weren't a member, you didn't work. Period. And to get in, you had to be racially and politically acceptable. So the regime didn't just ban critical voices. It banned whole professions from being independent at all. What followed was a sanitized, manicured cultural landscape. Plays were rewritten. Books disappeared. Music was filtered. Even jazz musicians were told their rhythms were un-German. The regime claimed to preserve culture, but instead placed it in a museum of glass walls and locked doors. The irony? A state that preached national greatness feared the unpredictable power of a paintbrush. The same state that mythologized Wagnerian operas now had a hotline to report suspicious cabaret lyrics. And speaking of headlines, not even journalism escaped the ideological broom. 6. Editor's Law, Schriftleiter Gazettes. Aryan requirements for journalists, editors. If you thought press freedom in Nazi Germany was limited to a few banned articles, think smaller and darker. On October 4, 1933, the regime passed the Editor's Law, a statute that made it illegal for Jews, or anyone deemed politically unreliable, to be an editor or journalist. Not by accusation, by definition. To be a journalist now meant submitting to background checks, moral scrutiny, and racial vetting. Applicants had to prove their Aryan ancestry, show loyalty to the Reich, and get approved by the propaganda ministry. That meant your family tree became a job requirement. Your private beliefs? A liability. Your headlines? Evidence. The law didn't just purge individuals, it redesigned the very idea of media. Journalism was no longer about investigation or critique. It was a mouthpiece, managed by a ministry that saw truth as a tool, not a standard. Newspapers became less about news and more about affirmations. Readers weren't supposed to learn anything. They were supposed to agree. What's absurd is the obsessive paperwork of it all. Imagine needing racial clearance to write a gardening column or filing ideological affidavits to publish sports commentary. The entire Fourth Estate became a fortress with a bouncer at the door, clipboard in hand, checking your bloodline. And if you thought censorship ended at the printing press, think again. Because the state had something to say about rhythm too. 7. Jazz and swing restrictions, degenerate foreign music, often via local decrees. Somewhere between statecraft and dance policing, the Nazi regime decided that certain rhythms were unacceptable. Jazz and swing music, styles associated with American culture, black musicians, and the vaguely defined threat of cultural decay, were targeted not with one sweeping ban, but through an uneven quilt of local decrees, venue crackdowns, and performance restrictions. By the late 1930s, clubs were raided, concerts canceled, and entire styles of music branded degenerate. Youth scenes that gravitated towards swing, especially the so-called swing youth subculture, were monitored, harassed, or pressured into conformity. Not because they were violent, not because they were political, but because they liked syncopation and American saxophones. The contradiction? Many Nazi officials privately enjoyed jazz. Some SS officers had swing records at home, but ideology didn't care for rhythm. Jazz was un-German, too free-form, too black, too transatlantic. The state's fear wasn't just about race. It was about unpredictability. Jazz resisted choreography, and the regime feared anything that couldn't march. The result? A dance hall could become a subversive space, a trumpet solo, a rebellious act. The regime tried to turn music into an instrument of national hygiene, but every saxophone note sounded like mockery. And just when you thought music was the only thing on trial, the Nazis decided that even harmony had a racial profile. 8. Degenerate music. Framing Entartetmusik as public cultural policing. In 1938, the Nazi regime hosted a traveling exhibit titled Entartetmusik, Degenerate Music. This wasn't just a critique. It was a public humiliation campaign masquerading as cultural curation. The exhibit framed entire genres, jazz, atonality, swing, anything Jewish or modernist, as moral disease. Visitors walked past photos of band composers and sheet music annotated with sneering captions. It was art criticism by way of mugshot lineup. The absurdity was layered. Music, an abstract and emotional art form, was being tried for political crimes. Instruments were racialized. Chords became suspicious. Composers like Schoenberg or Mendelssohn were erased, not because of dissonance, but because their ancestry failed the racial test. German identity, the regime claimed, had a sound, and it was suspiciously tonal, slow, and preferably Wagnerian. Radio programming was purged, orchestras were audited, even school music curricula were cleansed. This wasn't taste, it was enforcement, and it revealed the regime's deeper anxiety, that even something as invisible as sound could carry ideas, loyalties, or emotional contagion. Of course, the irony didn't end there. Despite its public crusade, the regime quietly used music when it suited its needs. Military marches, sentimental ballads, even occasionally the jazz it banned. Ideology demanded purity, practice settled for hypocrisy, and if you thought soup was safe from politics, think again. 9. One Pot Sunday, Eintopfsonntag. Social pressure to eat a simple stew and donate savings. Picture this. It's Sunday in Nazi Germany. You and your family are expected to eat a humble one-pot stew, Eintopf, not because you're short on ingredients, but because the government said so. Welcome to Eintopfsonntag, a performative display of collective sacrifice tied to the winter relief charity campaigns. The idea? Skip the roast, eat cheap, and donate the savings to the state's welfare fund. Restaurants were required to serve Eintopf at fixed prices. Households were publicly expected to participate. Posters urged unity through simplicity. The one-pot meal became a culinary loyalty test. Did your neighbors notice you baking a goose on Eintopf Sunday? Well, maybe you weren't as committed to the people's community as you claimed. The absurdity wasn't in the charity, it was in the pageantry. Eating stew became a moral theater act. You weren't just feeding your family. You were signaling ideological purity. And as with most Nazi regulations, participation was voluntary, in the same way that standing at attention in a thunderstorm is optional when your commanding officer says so. Eintopfsonntag wasn't about food. It was about obedience dressed up as virtue. Even thriftiness became political. And if the regime could choreograph your dinner menu, it was only a matter of time before they turned their gaze to your cigarette. 10. Anti-smoking rules. Bans on smoking in trams, and later buses, city trains. In 1941, amid a war of unprecedented scale, the Nazi regime turned its attention to a different kind of battlefield: public transportation. Specifically, trams. Smoking in them? Banned. Later, the same rule crept into buses, city trains, and even some workplaces. Not for fire safety, not for passenger comfort, but for reasons wrapped in ideological hygiene and productivity rhetoric. The regime framed it as a matter of national health. But this wasn't a health-conscious government. It was an authoritarian state trying to micromanage vices. Smoking was condemned as a moral weakness, especially among women, whom propaganda posters warned might compromise their racial duty by indulging in cigarettes. At the same time, top Nazi officials, including Hitler, publicly loathed smoking while others quietly puffed away in private. Enforcement was patchy. Some cities took the rules seriously, posting signs and handing out fines. Others treated them as aspirational guidelines. But the real absurdity was in the contradiction. A regime bent on controlling every inch of your life, your art, your music, your marriage, also wanted to control your ashtray. And while the state policed lungs on the trams, it was also rewriting the rules for what cigarette ads could say in the first place. 11. Ban on tobacco advertising styles and limits on where ads could appear. On December 7, 1941, while the world reeled from global warfare, Nazi Germany took a bold stand against cigarette slogans. The regime enacted restrictions on how tobacco could be advertised. No more smoking is harmless claims. No more carefree imagery. Ad copy had to align with the regime's narrative of health, strength, and racial duty. You could sell a cigarette, but not with a smile. What began as public health concern quickly turned into propaganda hygiene. Tobacco companies were told not just where they could advertise, but how. No ads near schools, no glamorizing slogans, and certainly no depictions of happy, independent women lighting up in public. This was less about lungs and more about optics. The regime wanted citizens to see strength and restraint, not decadence. Yet behind the curtain, Nazi officials still accepted tobacco tax revenue. Soldiers were issued cigarettes. Tobacco rations became part of wartime morale. The hypocrisy smoked its way through every policy page. The contradiction? A government that preached self-control while engineering mass hysteria. A state that could rationalize racial persecution, but drew the line at a too-friendly cigarette jingle. And if you thought moral purity was reserved for lungs and slogans, just wait until you hear what they did for the animals. 12. Animal Protection Law, Reichstierschutzgesetz. Detailed rules on cruelty, slaughter, experiments. On November 24, 1933, the Nazi regime passed one of the most comprehensive animal protection laws in Europe. It outlawed cruelty, regulated slaughter practices, and set limits on animal testing. On paper, it was a sweeping gesture toward compassion. The reality, a haunting paradox, a regime that publicly championed the welfare of animals while systematically dehumanizing people. Farmers had to follow strict guidelines. Universities conducting research on animals required approvals. Even circuses were monitored for how they treated their performers, not the human ones, but the lions and elephants. Official speeches proclaimed that a new moral order had dawned, one that respected the natural order of life. Posters appeared reminding citizens to be kind to dogs, even as citizens themselves could be arrested for whispering the wrong joke. This wasn't policy, it was ideological theater. Animal protection became another tool in the regime's propaganda arsenal. A way to project purity, virtue, and national renewal, while using that same language to justify brutal hierarchies among humans. The contradiction wasn't subtle. It was the point. Morality wasn't universal. It was racially assigned. A dog's suffering was legislated. A person's was not. And with animals now protected by decree, the Nazis set their sights on protecting something even more symbolic, the landscape itself. 13. Reich Nature Protection Law, Reichsnaturschutzgesetz. State control over landscapes, plants, animals. In 1935, Nazi Germany passed the Reich Nature Protection Law, a sweeping piece of legislation aimed at conserving Germany's native landscapes, flora, and fauna. It established protected zones, restricted land development, and elevated the idea of nature as something sacred, German, and ideologically charged. At face value, it looked like environmental progressivism. But scratch the surface, and you'll find ideological roots tangled in myth and propaganda. The law was deeply tied to the blood and soil ideology. Nature wasn't just to be preserved, it was to be owned, mythologized, and used as a mirror for racial purity. Hills, trees, rivers, all seen as reflections of the Aryan homeland. Conservation wasn't about biodiversity, it was about national identity, land control, and aesthetic conformity. Developers and farmers now needed permits for changes on their own land. Certain trees couldn't be cut down. Buildings had to blend into native scenery. The policy used the language of guardianship, but functioned like a leash, tightening control over rural life and enforcing ideological obedience through environmental stewardship. The irony? While the regime defended meadows, it bulldozed entire communities. It preserved birdsong while silencing dissent. And in this upside-down world of values, even font choices weren't safe from ideological about-faces. 14. Ban on fracture, black letter printing, rebranded as Jewish letters. For years, the Nazis embraced fracture, ornate black letter typefaces, as the visual soul of German tradition. It was the script of medieval manuscripts and national romanticism. Official documents, school books, even propaganda materials were printed in it. Then, seemingly overnight in January 1941, the regime declared it un-German. Worse, they branded it Jewish in origin and banned its use. This reversal came from the top. Martin Bormann circulated a memo stating that Fraktur, long held up as a symbol of national identity, was in fact a deception. From now on, normal schrift, a Latin-style font, would replace it. The reasoning? Occupied territories needed legibility. Fraktur was too German for foreign readers, so naturally it had to be thrown under the ideological bus. The absurdity? A regime that spent years worshipping a script suddenly condemned it based on a fabricated racial theory. Publishers, schools, printers, everyone had to shift. Fonts weren't just design choices, they were loyalty statements. This wasn't just bureaucratic whim. It was a case study in how ideology eats its own logic. The very typeface once used to define Germanness became a traitor, and once the letters were cleansed, it was time to change how young Germans wrote them in the first place. 15. Ban on teaching using current Sutherland handwriting in schools. Shift to normal schrift. If printed letters could betray the Reich, cursive wasn't far behind. Beginning in the 1941-42 academic year, the Nazi regime phased out traditional German handwriting styles, current and Sutherland, from schools. Students were instead taught a new Latin-based script dubbed normal schrift. The justification? Efficiency, standardization, and, as usual, ideological purity hiding behind practicality. Sutherland had been taught in German schools since the early 20th century. It was spiky, hard to read, and, according to Nazi officials, ill-suited for administration across the ever-growing Reich. Latin script, they said, would ensure consistency in record-keeping and better communication in occupied territories. But beneath that argument lurked a deeper obsession, streamlining the German child into a tool of the state, right down to their handwriting. Teachers had to be retrained. Textbooks were reissued. Students were told their old script was obsolete. Overnight, entire generations were told their penmanship was politically inconvenient. The irony? This was a regime that wrapped itself in traditionalism while constantly rewriting its own traditions. First, they fetishized the German script. Then they purged it. Ideological convenience overruled cultural continuity, and with the classroom reshaped, the regime moved to finish its grip on youth, not just how they wrote, but how they lived. 16. Law on the Hitler Youth, claiming all youth as state-organized youth. On December 1, 1936, the Nazi regime formalized what had already been building for years. All Aryan German youth were now part of a single state-run organization, the Hitler Youth. It wasn't a club anymore. It was law. Childhood, once defined by family, school, or neighborhood games, was now a project of national engineering. The regime didn't just want loyal citizens. It wanted pre-loyal ones. Children who would grow into adults without ever having imagined a life outside the party. Sports, hikes, songs, group bonding, wrapped in uniforms, marches, and ideological drills. It was youth rebranded as preparation for obedience. And the law didn't just permit this transformation, it required it. Schools were expected to coordinate with Hitler Youth leaders. Parents were pressured. Teachers became informants. Childhood spontaneity was replaced with state-orchestrated weekends and slogan-filled chants. If you were young, you weren't just growing up, you were being shaped. And the contradiction? The regime claimed to defend tradition and family, yet it infiltrated both, redesigning loyalty to begin with a salute instead of a bedtime story. The family became secondary, the Führer came first. And just when you thought you could still opt out, the state closed the final loophole with penalties. 17. Youth Service Regulation. Compulsory membership ages 10 to 18, with criminal penalties. By March 25, 1939, Nazi Germany no longer relied on moral pressure or social expectation to fill the ranks of its youth organizations. It simply made membership in the Hitler Youth compulsory, by law. Every German child between 10 and 18 was now legally required to join, provided they fit the regime's racial criteria. What began as a movement was now a mandate. The regulation transformed nonconformity into criminality. Failure to enroll wasn't just frowned upon. It was punishable. Parents could be investigated. Youths could face legal action. Schools tracked participation. Whole communities learned to monitor compliance like a civic duty. The state's justification? National unity, moral discipline, and physical health. But the real reason was far more utilitarian: total control. The Hitler Youth was not just a youth program, it was a pipeline. One that fed into the army, the labor corps, the SS. It taught hierarchy, submission, uniformity. Individuality was sanded down in favor of national shape. And the tragic absurdity? The law didn't just criminalize refusal. It criminalized difference. Children were no longer allowed to grow, only to conform. And while the regime molded children to fit its vision, it offered young couples a curious incentive: ideological matrimony with a loan application. 18. Marriage loans. State-subsidized Aryan marriage tied to household consumption and gender roles. In 1933, the Nazi regime introduced marriage loans, interest-free state loans given to newlywed Aryan couples, provided they met racial and ideological requirements. The policy was pitched as economic stimulus, but it quickly became clear. This wasn't about helping families, it was about engineering them. Couples received a loan if the bride left her job. Each child born forgave part of the debt. Motherhood was rewarded. Female employment discouraged. The goal wasn't just to boost birth rates. It was to shape the kind of households the regime deemed ideal: patriarchal, fertile, racially vetted, and economically submissive. Even the consumption side was controlled. The loans came with marriage loan certificates used to buy household goods from approved vendors. Private life was no longer private. It was a state-subsidized performance of national values. And yet, it was all wrapped in cheerful messaging: photos of smiling couples, cozy apartments, happy children, a propaganda postcard of domestic bliss, backed by bureaucratic strings and ideological contracts. This was marriage by state design. Love was fine, as long as it came with paperwork and the right ancestry. And if you were SS, that paperwork came with even more requirements. Romantic approval wasn't enough without a racial background check. 19. SS marriage controls. Ancestry proof plus medical exams before marriage. For members of the SS, falling in love came with a checklist. Before tying the knot, SS personnel had to submit ancestry documents proving both they and their intended spouses were of Aryan descent, going back multiple generations. Medical exams were required too, ensuring the couple was not only racially pure by Nazi definitions, but also genetically fit. Romantic, right? This wasn't just a suggestion. It was an institutional expectation embedded into SS culture as a point of pride and ideological duty. The marriage had to be approved by SS headquarters. Family trees were traced. Hereditary health reports filed, sometimes taking months. A love letter could lead to a genetics file. Why? Because the SS saw itself as more than a military or police force. It was the regime's self-proclaimed racial elite. Every marriage was a strategic alliance in the Nazi dream of engineered heredity. Personal relationships became part of a national breeding policy. It was eugenics disguised as matchmaking, bureaucracy masquerading as virtue. And yet, while the SS measured bloodlines to approve weddings, the regime was also busy criminalizing intimacy itself, when it occurred across a racial line. 20. Nuremberg. Blood protection law. Banning marriages or sex between Jews and German blood. Introduced on September 15, 1935, the Nuremberg Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor made it illegal for Jews to marry or have intimate relations with people classified as German or related blood. With this, the Nazi state didn't just police behavior. It legislated desire, ancestry, and biology itself. The law wasn't vague. It was detailed, invasive, and cold. It criminalized relationships that already existed and invalidated marriages retroactively. Couples were torn apart. Suspicions triggered investigations. People's private lives were scrutinized with bureaucratic detachment and prosecuted with public theater. To enforce it, the regime conducted ancestry investigations and tracked social interactions. Jews and non-Jews caught in relationships faced public shaming, legal penalties, and court trials that read like surreal morality plays. The absurdity? The Nazis, who claimed to be restoring traditional morality, had turned the most personal of human connections into a legal battlefield. Love was outlawed by racial algebra, and they didn't stop at marriages. They even had regulations about who could clean your house. 21. Nuremberg add-on. Jews barred from employing Aryan household maids under 45. As part of the same Nuremberg framework, the Nazi regime banned Jewish households from employing German women under the age of 45 as domestic workers. The reasoning? That these situations posed a so-called racial risk, a paranoid fantasy of impropriety, born from the regime's obsession with controlling both race and gender roles. The rule was not about labor, cleanliness, or wages. It was about optics and fear. It presumed that any domestic employment arrangement involving a young Aryan woman in a Jewish home was a threat to the racial order. So the state intervened, not in factories or boardrooms, but in kitchens and laundry rooms. Denunciations followed. Households were inspected. A woman scrubbing a floor became a national concern if she was too young and the employer's ancestry didn't pass muster. The reach of ideology was total. It trickled down to who ironed your shirts. This wasn't security policy. It was paranoia enacted as law. And with maids restricted and relationships banned, the regime still had one more humiliation to add, this time using flags. 22. Nuremberg add-on. Jews barred from flying the swastika flag. Under the same suite of racial laws introduced in September 1935, the Nazis didn't just restrict marriage and employment, they also dictated who could fly a flag. Specifically, the swastika. Jews in Germany were legally prohibited from displaying the national flag or its emblem, which by this time had been fully absorbed into the identity of the state. This may seem trivial on the surface. Who cares about a flag? But in a regime obsessed with symbols, the message was unmistakable. You don't belong here. The law wasn't about safeguarding national symbols. It was about visual exclusion. The swastika wasn't just a flag. It was a loyalty badge, a boundary marker. And now, even the act of not displaying it was legally coded with suspicion. This rule functioned like all effective totalitarian tools. Absurdly small, but deeply loaded. Your balcony could betray you. Your storefront could get you fined. Citizenship became something you could signal, or not, through fabric and thread. And it was only the beginning. Because soon, it wouldn't be enough for the state to decide what symbols you couldn't use. They'd decide what names you could have, too. 23. Forced Israel, Sarah middle names for Jews with non-Jewish first names. By August 1938, the Nazi regime issued a new decree. Any Jew in Germany who did not already have a recognizably Jewish first name had to adopt a mandatory middle name, Israel for men and Sarah for women. This wasn't about standardizing paperwork. It was about branding identity, enforcing visibility, and building a society where your name became a warning label. Effective. January 1st, 1939, the policy turned every bank form, school record, doctor's appointment, or police document into a ritual of public identification. Names weren't just recorded, they were pronounced, spoken out loud in offices and waiting rooms, read on lists, embedded into every interaction. This wasn't identity, it was bureaucracy as humiliation. The goal was clear: erase ambiguity. Make Jewishness visible even when it wasn't obvious. Strip away the possibility of blending in or opting out. The absurdity lay in the state's obsession with names. The same regime that demanded conformity in dress, language, and belief now reached into birth certificates to ensure that even your signature betrayed you. And if your name wasn't enough, they had one more tool to make your identity inescapable. This time, stamped in your passport. 24. Passports invalidated unless stamped with a big J. On October 5, 1938, the Reich Ministry of the Interior declared all Jewish passports invalid, unless they were reissued with a bold red J stamped on the front cover. This wasn't just about border control. It was about official branding, an administrative scarlet letter that turned a travel document into a declaration of otherness. The J didn't grant access. It signaled restriction. Foreign countries could now immediately identify Jewish travelers. Internally, the stamp marked the holder as someone to be monitored, questioned, or denied. The state claimed it was about order, but it functioned as stigma, portable and permanent. You couldn't remove it. You couldn't cover it. And without it, you couldn't leave. Even more chilling was the bureaucratic detachment of it all. It came in the form of regulations, forms, queues at passport offices, as if altering the fate of lives were a clerical adjustment. Not with violence, but with ink. In a regime that turned the mundane into mechanisms of control, even travel became a trap. And if that wasn't surreal enough, the Nazis had one final absurd frontier left to police: fortune-telling. 25. Occultism. Fortune-telling crackdowns, police actions, and bans on superstition practices. In the late 1930s, while Nazi officials plotted grand strategies and occupied territories, they were also waging a quieter war against astrologers, card readers, and amateur mystics. Fortune-telling, seances, horoscopes, palm reading, practices that had existed on the margins of society for centuries were suddenly reclassified as threats to the Reich. Crackdowns came not through a single national law, but through regional police actions, scattered bans, and increasing restrictions. The justification? Public fraud, moral decay, distraction from duty. But beneath that was a deeper fear. The regime demanded monopoly over truth. There could be no competing narratives, not even ones delivered via crystal ball. The irony was thick. This was a government steeped in mythic racial theories and historical fantasies, yet it couldn't tolerate tarot cards. Nazi ideology trafficked in mysticism and destiny on a mass scale, but individual spiritual curiosity? That was dangerous. So practitioners were investigated. Some were banned from operating. Others arrested for deceiving the public. Even publishing an astrology column could trigger police interest. In the end, what the regime feared wasn't magic, it was autonomy. Even irrational belief, if uncontrolled, was too much freedom. And with that final rule, the curtain closes on a regime that tried to legislate everything, from your handshake to your horoscope.